Hi, everyone. My name is Vidi Castro. I am a graduate student at UC Santa Cruz here in California. And today I will be following up on Matt's awesome presentation of dry farm tomatoes and talking a little bit about the physiology of these tomatoes. All right, so a little bit about plant physiology. I know Patty earlier talked a little bit about the physiology of grapes, so I want to talk about the type of research that I work on here at Santa Cruz. So I'm interested in studying the variation of the structure of plants at the molecular and cellular level. And so what I'm mostly interested in, why I got into grad school, is to study the plant water transport system. So pictured on the left, you see vessels, which are tubes within the plants, and these transport water from the roots through the stem all the way to the leaves, where leaves have stomata that open up for transpiration. What I also want to study here at my time in Santa Cruz is how will crops respond as climatic conditions grow warmer and drier, right? So we know the impacts of climate change affect agriculture through excessive precipitation, excessive heat, introducing new pests and disease pressures, and also drought, right? And how that negatively impacts crops. And so specifically, drought impacts agriculture through increases in water costs, increases in plants' vulnerability to diseases such as blight, and losses in yields and economic impact, right? And so here we see a picture of a field that uses a ton of water, and we know that 80 to 90% of the country's total water is used for agriculture. And so a solution to this problem, which all of you here have been hearing about this morning, is a sustainable form of agriculture, dry farming. And so Matt talked about, the different definitions for dry farming. Here at the Center for Agroecology in Santa Cruz, we classify it as minimal water input. So these plants are irrigated at the beginning just to get the seedlings established once they're in the ground. And then after that, they're not irrigated at all throughout the rest of the season. And so some benefits of dry farming include the promotion of deep rooting, maintaining crop production throughout the growing season for a longer period of time, and increasing crop flavor intensity. And so just to give you an idea of the different traits that I am interested in studying, here we have a picture of a tomato and a standard variety that would be watered throughout the season. What you may see is more shallow roots, leaves with lots of stomata that open up and allow for water to flow, which is great because they let water out and CO2 in for photosynthesis, which creates the sugars that then creates these larger fruits that are filled with water. Whereas a dry farm adapted crop on the bottom shows that there is the promotion of those deeper roots, right? And then you see that the stomata, again, those pores in that leaf, we may see less of those to conserve water in order to allow the plant to survive during drought. And a side effect of that is growing fruit that are much smaller and have less water, but may have more intense flavors. And so these are traits that I'm interested in studying. And this is kind of the basis for my research. And so with that in mind, my main question that I wanted to ask this past summer when I started my trials is, what physiological traits do dry farm tomatoes have that make them so successful? And so here on the right, you see a picture of my undergraduate helpers. We were out there this past summer of 2024. And some of the questions we asked in more detail are, how do these dry farm tomatoes use water throughout the season? What are the physiological and structural costs of different water use strategies? And how is crop quality and crop quantity affected? And so we conducted this research here in UC Santa Cruz at the school farm, known as the Center for Agroecology. And so we looked at two varieties of tomato. We looked at the Slicer Cherokee Purple, which is more of an heirloom tomato. And we looked at the dry farm adapted Dirty Girl variety, which is commonly used for dry farming here in California. And so we planted them in two separate groups. We planted them under dry farm conditions and under irrigated conditions to really see how they would grow and respond differently when there's water present and when there's no water present. And so we collected a lot of data. We wanted to focus on traits that had to do with the physiology, the morphology, the anatomy, and fruit traits. And we also collected soil data. As we've seen in the other presentations, this is really important to include. And so that data includes water content, nutrient levels, and organic matter. And just for the sake of time, I won't be going into the soil data today. But on the left, I just want to briefly go over these images. You see on the top left corner, those are my students measuring water potentials with a pressure bomb. Then you have that circle on the right. And so if you haven't seen something like this before, this is a cross-section of a tomato stem. So we've sliced through the stem. And so it's kind of hard to see here, but the little white circles in the middle are the cells that transport water throughout the stem. Then in the middle, we have a vein network of a tomato leaf, which we also measure. And then again, my students in the field collecting photosynthesis and then collecting fruit. And so I just wanted to, again, go over my varieties just to give you an idea of how they're growing in the field and how they differ. The non-adapted Slicer Cherokee Purple on the left, so you can see it grows much smaller, but produces these larger fruits that are have higher water content. And then we have the dry farm adapted Dirty Girl, which grows a much larger plant, but you can see that it has smaller, more compact fruit on the right. And so again, we measured lots of different measurements, but I've included a few of the measures here in graphs just to give you an idea of how these differed in the field. So I want you to focus on the graph on the left. These are the varieties, Dirty Girl in green and Slicer in purple, grown under drought treatment. And you can see that the Dirty Girl, as we saw in the pictures, grew taller throughout the entirety of the season. So they produced a much larger plant, whereas the Slicers grew a little smaller. But when we compare it to the panel on the right, the irrigated, they actually didn't differ much when the plants were watered. So this was an interesting finding we saw where we weren't seeing too many differences. Then we measured water potential throughout the season, and water potential is another way of saying the water status of the plant. So how much water was available within the plant itself. And so the higher the value closer to zero, the more water available within the plant, and the lower the value, the more dry the plant is. And we can see again, focusing on the panel on the left, the Dirty Girl in green had a much lower water status. So it is adapted to drought and it can withstand these lower water potential values. And we also measured stomatal conductance. So this is the rate of gas exchange and transpiration through the leaf, through those open stomata. And so this is telling us that the plant is leaving their stomata open for water to go out, for CO2 to come in order for the plant to photosynthesize. And we can see that the Dirty Girl had slightly higher rates of stomatal conductance. So they're leaving their stomata open. But again, they didn't differ too much from that non-adapted Slicer variety. So we were asking ourselves, right, are these varieties even different? And really where we saw the main difference so far is in the yields throughout the season. So if you look at the panel on the left, which is the dry farm plots, we see that the Dirty Girl had a much higher yield than the slicer varieties. So they were able to perform for longer in the season and produce much higher yields than the non-adapted crop, which is ultimately the question we were asking, right? Are these dry farm Dirty Girl varieties going to perform better in terms of yield? And so when we compare it to the variety when they're irrigated, we see that the Dirty Girls planted under irrigated interestingly produce lower total yields by the end of the season when we compare it 232 kilograms to 137 kilograms. So now that we know that the dry farm Dirty Girl does perform better in terms of fruit yield, we're asking ourselves, what are the specific traits that allow for these varieties, right, to have such high yields? We're scratching our heads right now trying to answer this question. And so one thing we're seeing is that the Dirty Girl variety overall, no matter what treatment it's planted in, have higher rates of photosynthesis, right? So they're more productive. They're able to produce those sugars for the plant to then feed the fruit. And so even when they're planted in dry farm conditions, they still have these high rates of photosynthesis. We're also looking at measurements such as the water potential at turgor loss point. So a way to explain this is if you see that picture of the leaves on the left, when they lose turgor is when these leaves become completely wilted, right? And so then at that point, they're no longer able to function physiologically, which is really bad for the plant. But if we look at this graph, the lower the water potential at turgor loss point indicates how drought adapted these plants are. And we see that the Dirty Girl planted under dry farm conditions has the lowest water potential at turgor loss point, indicating that this is a drought adapted crop. And it's indicating how it is so successful under these conditions. Another cool finding we're seeing has to do with vein density. So I talked earlier about imaging the vein networks of these tomato leaves. And so it has been found that the higher the vein density within the leaves indicates how productive they are. And so because they're able to transport so much water throughout their vein networks, they're then able to continue to photosynthesize and just overall be more productive plants. So growing larger and having more fruit, which is what we saw earlier in those other images. And so here we see that indeed the Dirty Girl variety has higher vein density in both dry farm and irrigated trees. So this is just a bit of the work I did last summer, and this is in collaboration with OSU. It's just the first part of a multi-step research program that I'm a part of. And so the first bit was just really understanding the physiology of these tomatoes, right? And I've shown you the work that we've completed so far from everything we collected from the summer, but there's still much work to do. We're also going to look at stem vessel areas, stomatal density, and on the right, you see a picture of the root cross section. So this is what these tomato roots look like on the inside. And we're also going to make measurements based on those pictures. And once we complete this step, we'll then go on to new projects to look at different varieties and plant different varieties at different farms. Just to get the big picture of how dry farm tomatoes are so successful. So it's very exciting. And just to remind you of the ultimate goal of this work, my research studies the management of carbon and water resources during dry farmed conditions, because my ultimate main objective is to find the traits that lead to drought resistance while also maintaining high fruit production. And so I want to find what traits allow these tomatoes to thrive in order to provide growers like you all with this context for when you're picking what varieties you want to grow. And so with that, I just want to acknowledge everyone who's been helpful. Shout out to OSU and the Dry Farm Collaborative for allowing me to present here today and for hear all these other awesome talks. And with that, if there's any questions, feel free to email me. I would love to hear more about everyone else's work here. Thank you.